Today I am going to tell you about a great and wonderful character whose name was Benjamin Franklin. As you know, Ben is best remembered as an American patriot who played an enormous role in the early history of New England. He was, as I like to say, a wonderful Yankee. It is not so well known, unfortunately, that Franklin was a great scientist. Indeed, we must rank him as the first great American man of science. But he was more than this, as we shall see, for his story is truly the saga of a man who came up from rags to riches, a man who was, in his own lifetime, a storyteller, a printer, a writer, an orator, a humorist, a philosopher, an ambassador, a maker of almanacs, a tinkerer with thousands of things, a maker of maxims and bits of wit, a jack and master of many trades, an inventor. He was indeed a genius. Now it came the winter of 1706. The day, in fact, was the 6th of January, 1706. It was a Sunday. A blizzard was raging. Snow was in heaps and drifting, and the cold was severe. And we are to imagine the men of the village gathered in the taverns talking about one thing: how they could get firewood to their homes and food to their families, and how their oxen could stand the bitter weather. But there was also one other thing they were talking about in the taverns, and it was this: Josiah Franklin's home had another child. A boy Benjamin was born. He was the 7th of 10 children, and if indeed you count Josiah's first marriage, there were 17 all told. Josiah, the father, was a maker and seller of candles. And we are to imagine the children gathered in the long winter days and nights, filling candle molds, and on the brighter days going about the village, selling them to the villagers. The household was reared in the strictest discipline, and much instruction was given in common sense and a taste for work and simplicity. A taste for work and simplicity. And this is what characterized Ben Franklin throughout his years. He was a tiny fellow, very plump and fat, bright-eyed, with a round face, and extraordinarily quick in his mind. At 5, he could read the Bible, and at 7, he knew how to write. And it was at this age that he engaged in his first big financial transaction, which gave him a lesson he remembered all his life. And this was the event. He bought a whistle for 10 pennies. And when his father examined it, he said to Benjamin, "So you gave 10 pennies for a whistle worth but 2. Thus was Ben introduced to the business of thrift and money, which he practiced with great wisdom throughout his years. It was his first adventure in high finance, spending 10 pennies for a whistle that was worth but 2. At school, he was taught, among other things, Latin and arithmetic, and in the latter he failed shamefully. But as I shall show you later, he had some wonderful remarks to make about the beauty and virtue of mathematics, even though as a child he did poorly with it. So poorly indeed did he do that his father took him out of school with the intention of making a candle maker out of him. But Ben had already developed a taste for reading, a virtue that stayed with him all his life. And before he was 10, he had read Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and Plutarch's Lives and a book of essays written by the famous Cotton Mather entitled Essays to Do Good. And we must remember this, Essays to Do Good, because the name played a role in Franklin's life later. So Ben was now 11 years old. He could not find anything that interested him to do as a livelihood. He didn't want to be a candle maker. So his father took him about the village of Boston to see the various tradesmen and craftsmen, hoping that he would find something to latch onto as his own industry. And what resulted from this adventure? Every craftsman and tradesman that Benjamin saw, he so enjoyed the work that was done that he had difficulty in picking one for his own. What he thought of most highly was the honor of honorable labor, as the great tradesmen and craftsmen demonstrated in their work. The honor of honorable labor. Now Ben had a brother whose name was James. James was a printer. And Ben was indentured to his brother as an assistant in the shop. What did James print? James printed religious brochures and sermons and almanacs and official notices and the news of the world, which he got from the sailors in the taverns who had come from this place and that place in their ships. Now this indenture, which Ben signed, had with it the following promise: his lawful commands everywhere to gladly do, to stay with him until his 22nd year, to serve him faithfully, to keep his secrets. And there was added this phrase: taverns, inns, or alehouses he shall not haunt. At cards, dice, and other lawful game he shall not play. Matrimony he shall not contract. Now, in addition, his brother James supplied him with meat, drink, washing, and lodging. And here there came to pass a wonderful event in the life of Ben. Ben decided that he would take half the money that his brother was paying for his board and room and drink and washing and lodging and the like, take half of it and feed himself. And the reason for this was as follows. Ben was not too fond of eating meat. He was of the view that it was shameful to slaughter animals simply for the purpose of eating their flesh. And furthermore, he preferred to live on vegetables and broth, they being the cheaper. And in this adventure, he saved a great deal of his money. And what did he do with that money? He bought books. He bought books with the money that was left over from his lodging and food. Now, regarding his unhappiness with the eating of animal flesh, there is a wonderful little tale. Remember, as I say, Ben was against the killing of animals for the purpose of eating their flesh, for, as he said, they had done no one any hurt. And now, one day, Ben went on a fishing trip with friends, and many fish were caught. And when some of the big ones were opened up, Ben saw that they had inside them some little ones. Whereupon he changed his philosophy regarding the eating of flesh by saying, if they can eat their own, I can surely eat them. And thus he dropped his view of being a vegetarian. Isn't that wonderful? If they can eat their own, I can certainly eat them. Now, while Ben was in the employ of his brother, the printer, Remember that he had read widely and much. He decided to do some writing. And the problem was how to get it printed. And he resorted to this wonderful little device. He wrote little articles which he signed with the name of Silence Dogood. Silence Dogood. And these little essays he slipped under the door of his brother's shop so that in the morning his brother found them, whereupon he read them, indeed invited the clergy and farmers to read them, and they were enchanted with what was said in these little essays, and decided that it must be a man of great talent and wit who had written them. Now it turns out that there was much asking of his brother James, who has written these things? Who has written these essays? But his brother didn't know, nor indeed would Ben reveal the fact. So for some years it was not known who had written these beautiful little essays and ditties. Ben, after a time, left his brother's employ, went to Philadelphia on a boat. And in his autobiography, which I hope you will read because it is a wonderful story of an American boy, quite like an Horatio Alger tale, From Bootblack to Riches or the like. In his autobiography, he describes himself landing in Philadelphia, hungry and dirty, with his extra shirts and stockings in his pockets, and $1 to his name. Indeed, he reports that all who saw him laughed at him. But he got a job, made friends, saved some money, and took a journey to London. It was at this time in his life that he laid down what he called 4 rules of living. 4 rules of living. Number 1, economy. Number 2, perseverance. Number 3, goodwill. And number 4, loyalty. Economy, perseverance, goodwill, loyalty. In addition, he drew up what he called his design for perfection. Design for perfection. And these were the virtues to which he gave his energy and industry: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. An array of 13 virtues designed for living, designed for perfection. And he gave his attention to these with such vigor that he was sure to encompass one completely in a week and then go to the next one. Now it is September 1730. Ben married a sweetheart of his by the name of Deborah Reed. Deborah was a poor girl. Her father had died, left no money. Her mother, however, had a business selling ointments. And in Ben's paper, there appeared the ad, which read as follows: "The widow Reed continues to make and sell her well-known ointment for the itch, with which she has cured an abundance of people. It also kills or drives away all sorts of lice in once or twice using. It has no offensive smell, but rather a pleasant one. Price, 2 shillings a pot, containing an ounce." Franklin was now 23. He was occupied with his shop and the education of his children. Indeed, he put an ad in the paper which read as follows: "Any person who has a servant to dispose of that is a scholar and can teach children reading, writing, and arithmetic may hear of a purchaser by inquiring of the printer hereof. And thus did Ben avail himself of servants who were reasonably well read to school his children. In addition, it must be noted that Ben had himself studied French and Spanish and Italian and schooled his children in those languages. So we are to imagine himself in his printing shop, printing tickets and leases and bills of sale and contracts and legal papers. And here too he sold ink and paper and pens and compasses and slates and goose quills. That's a wonderful thing to sell, goose quills. So we can picture him in his shop, in his old leather breeches with a leather apron, a flannel shirt, and he talked in abundance to all who came to his shop. With the clergy he discussed theology, with the scholars he discussed literature, with the farmers he discussed their planting and their harvests. Now came the great adventure by Mr. Franklin, the almanac. The almanac. In those days, it is well to remember that there were at least two things in every household. Two things: the Bible and Ben's almanac. The Bible, of course, told men whom to worship, how to worship, and when. And the almanac was a guide in earthly affairs. It told men, for example, when to plant, when to harvest, when catastrophes were imminent. It predicted the weather. It set down plans for affairs of the heart. It told when boats were coming and when boats were leaving, and thus gave the villagers a chance to learn the news from the sailors who came and went. And in connection with the almanac, there is a beautiful little tale which must be recited. We are to imagine that it is a good day, the sun is full, the sky is bright, and a farmer leaves for the city to sell his goods. But since the day was good, and the almanac said it would be, he left his heavy clothes at home. He had no hood for his cart, no covering for his head. But soon as the day went, the rain came down in torrents, and his goods were ruined and his clothes were soiled. And when he returned to the village, he sought out Ben, the writer of the almanac, and chided him for this misadventure, saying that it's going to be good weather when indeed it was not. Whereupon Benjamin replied as follows: "O friend, friend, be not thus angry, for although it was I that made the almanac, it was God who made the weather." Now we must turn and take a look at events elsewhere which changed the life of Ben Franklin and the history of the world. Let us, if you will, transport ourselves across the sea to the village of Leyden in Holland, sometimes pronounced Leiden. In the university, there was a professor by the name of Peter von Musschenbroek. And Professor von Musschenbroek had been experimenting with electrical discharges and static electricity. And he had designed a device known as the Leyden jar. It is indeed a sort of bottle affair in which electric charge can be stored. And he did a vast array of experiments with this Leyden jar. He sent shocks through people, and he electrocuted chickens, and he even roasted meat, and sent electric shocks across rivers. It was a fantastic array of things that von Musschenbroek did with his Leyden jar. Indeed, the experiments he did stirred all of Europe, and word reached Ben Franklin that there were some electric experiments going on elsewhere, whereupon he undertook the study of them himself. And as you know, this led him to the adventure with the kite. Because one of the questions that needed to be answered was this: is there any connection between the lightning we see in the sky and the electrical discharge which we make in the laboratory? And thus was Ben led to the experiments of the kite. Indeed, he was so taken by this study of the electrical phenomena that he gave up all his business to devote his time to it, to the exclusion of all else. As he wrote, "I never was before engaged in any study that so totally engrossed my attention and my time as this has lately done, for the novelty of the thing has taken me with a passion." And thus he came to a proper understanding of how to make lightning rods or lightning arresters. As he said, it may indeed protect homes and churches and barns from that terrible mischief called lightning. So having discovered the virtue of sharp points, he sent word to the Royal Society in England, reporting his experimental investigations of the electric fluid in the sky. Now a wonderful event transpired in the Royal Society. The president of the Royal Society, hearing of Franklin's work, invited his philosophers and scientists to study the virtue of sharp points, to find out what it is that Franklin is talking about. But soon word reached the king's ears, and the king, wishing to have no truck with a Yankee, urged the president of the Royal Society to abandon the study of sharp points and investigate the usefulness of spheres. Whereupon the president of the Royal Society said to the king, "I fear, your Royal Highness, that nature cannot be brought around by royal edict." Whereupon the king said to the president of the Royal Society, "These being your views, you had better consider your resignation," which indeed the president of the Royal Society did. Is not that an enchanting tale about the consequence of Ben Franklin, his kite, and sharp points? In connection with Benjamin's adventures with this electric fluid, a letter that he wrote to one of his friends is enchanting to read. In part he wrote, "I have lately made an experiment in electricity that I desire never to repeat." For later in the letter he reports a severe shock that he got, the numbness in his body lasting for several days. And this reminds me of a report that Peter von Muschenbroek wrote about the same thing, that he took a shock in his arms and chest, which were numb for days. And he added, "I would not take another such shock for the kingdom of France." Ben also wrote to his friend and said, "Do not make it more public, for I am ashamed of my folly." Now we are engaged in further discussion of Franklin's experiments. Remember, I said that he was a man, an extraordinary man of science. And here are some experiments which Franklin did, which you can indeed do yourself. The first one concerns the conductivity of heat. And for this purpose, Benjamin reports as follows. Take between the thumb and finger of one hand a silver coin, and in the finger and thumb of the other hand a sliver of wood of the same size, and holding them thus, put their remote edges in the tip of a candle flame. And what do you discover? Very soon indeed, you must drop the coin, but the wooden sliver can be held ever so long. And thus Ben concluded, with the first experiment in heat conductivity, that metals are good thermal conductors. And for this purpose, he said, a silver teapot must therefore have a wooden handle. There was another experiment that he did, which concerned itself with the effect of heat on objects of different color. And for this purpose, he reported this experiment. I took a number of pieces of cloth from a tailor of various colors. I laid them all out on the snow in a bright, sunshiny day, and in a few hours, what did I witness? I saw the following. The black, being warmed most by the sun, was sunk far below the top level of the snow. The dark blue sunk nearly as low, and the other colors less as they were brighter. Conclusion. Black clothes are not fit to be worn in hot, sunny days. As many of you know, one of the great accomplishments of Mr. Franklin was the invention of bifocal glasses, bifocals. And here is his report of them. Benjamin writes, I therefore had formerly 2 pairs of spectacles, which I shifted occasionally, as in traveling I sometimes read, and often wanting to regard the prospects afar. And so you see, in order to read, he needed 1 pair of glasses, and then to see at a distance out of the railroad car, he needed another pair, which required him to change these. And with his astuteness for invention, and indeed given as he was to laziness, which we now know was the reason for his many inventions, he was indeed a very lazy fellow. Here is what he did. I had the glasses cut, and half of each kind associated in the same circle. By this means, as I wear my spectacles constantly, I have only to move my eyes up or down as I want to see distinctly, far or near, the proper glasses being always ready. And thus was born bifocal glasses. There are several other things that Mr. Franklin invented. The pot-bellied stove. Now, those of you who are from old New England history know that there still is to be found such a stove in New England farmhouses. And how did Ben come to invent the pot-bellied stove, which was intended to sit, as we say, in the middle of the parlor? He discovered that when the wood burned in the fireplace, most of the heat went up the stack and was thus lost. And you see, the invention then of the stove was a consequence of his New England frugality, the pot-bellied stove. And indeed, the rocking chair was invented by Mr. Franklin. And you can see him now sitting in the chair, rocking to and fro on the piazza of his home. And that's a very good word for you all, piazza. It means, of course, porch or veranda. And here we can see him rocking back and forth, chatting with the clergy or with the visiting sailors or with a farmer who might come to consult him on when to plant or when not to plant. And now finally, it is hard for us to believe it, but Ben Franklin had first the idea of daylight saving time. Since the almanac played such a role in Ben Franklin's life, and indeed in the lives of the New England villagers, I am led irresistibly to say a little more about Ben's almanac. You remember it was called Poor Richard. And it is interesting to know that he got this title from 2 English almanacs, which were in turn named Poor Robin and Richard Sumner. And out of this, you see, he created the joint name Poor Richard. So that in 1733, there came on the scene Poor Richard's Almanac, printed and sold by Benjamin Franklin, price 3 shillings 6 per dozen. It was indeed a terrific literary adventure. And in his first issues, he had certain little witty sayings and utterances which have lasted to this very day. Here are a few, for example. Each year, one vicious habit rooted out, in time might make the worst man good throughout. And here's another one. After 3 days, men grow weary of a guest and rainy weather. Men grow weary of a guest and rainy weather. And still another. 3 things are men most likely to be cheated in: a horse, a wig, and a wife. A horse, a wig, and a wife. Now he made every effort to improve his almanac by writing in it little essays on matters immediate to the scene. And here was the title of one: Ways and Means of Keeping People from Falling and Breaking Their Noses on the Slippery, Icy Streets. Isn't that enchanting to contemplate? Ways and means of keeping people from falling and breaking their noses on the slippery, icy streets. Now, being of a frugal nature and knowing the substance of thrift and remembering the lesson of high finance with the purchase of the whistle that was worth but 2 pennies and for which he paid 10, he improved his almanac. And it was now entitled Poor Richard Improved. He decorated it with fancy woodcuts. It now contained 36 pages instead of 24, and he kept the price the same. Here was Franklin's thrift and virtue, so that it defied all competition. No almanac, indeed, could approach it for beauty and richness. And in it he had little ditties written in French and Italian and Spanish and Latin, so as to give the villagers the feeling that Ben was one of the great intellectuals of the hour. There is, as you know, associated with Ben Franklin's name, a vast array of little utterances which come as a consequence of his design for perfect living. Let me recite a few. It is hard for an empty sack to stand upright. It is hard for an empty sack to stand upright. Experience keeps a dear school, but fools will learn in no other. Never leave that till tomorrow which you can do today. Time is money. And here's one which everybody remembers. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. And here is a pretty little one. Little strokes fell great oaks. Little strokes fell great oaks. And another. A little neglect may breed mischief. For want of a nail the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe the horse was lost. And for want of a horse the rider was lost. And finally, idleness and pride tax with a heavier hand than kings and parliaments. And that's a beautiful thing. Idleness and pride tax with a heavier hand than kings and parliaments. An adage which all good boys and girls should adhere to with diligence. Now Ben had some reflections on anticipations of things to come. And here is one to which we should give attention. He wrote in a letter to Joseph Priestley in 1780, "The rapid progress true science now makes occasions my regretting sometimes that I was born so soon. It is impossible to imagine the height to which may be carried in 1,000 years the power of man over matter. We may perhaps learn to deprive large masses of their gravity and give them absolute levity for the sake of easy transport. And thus he anticipated the flying machine. Agriculture may diminish its labor. All diseases may be prevented or cured. And then this speculation, which holds as good today as in the day of Franklin. Oh, that moral science were in as fair a way of improvement, that men would cease to be wolves to one another, and that human beings would at length learn what they now improperly call humanity. Now at the Constitutional Convention, Ben Franklin had occasion to rise and make the following address. This which Ben now narrates is a measure of the devoutness of Mr. Franklin. Mr. President, he said, our different sentiments on almost every question is, methinks, a melancholy proof of the imperfection of the human understanding. I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, it is probable that an empire cannot rise without his aid. I therefore move that henceforth prayers employing the assistance of heaven be held in this assembly every morning. And this is exactly the practice followed in the government today. Finally, President Washington wrote to Ben Franklin a few months before the death of Franklin. This letter, which is stirring to contemplate. Washington writes, if to be venerated for benevolence, if to be admired for talents, if to be esteemed for patriotism, if to be beloved for philanthropy, can gratify the human mind, you must have the pleasing consolation to know that you have not lived in vain. A marvelous expression of one great man for another. And to close our narration on Franklin, I recite the classical phrase of the great French mathematician Jean-Le-Rond d'Alembert. You remember, by way of introduction, that Mr. Franklin had taken the lightning from the sky and harnessed it with his lightning rods, and he also had lived a life of an ambassador for America and the European countries. So D'Alembert wrote the following epigram. He snatched the thunderbolt from heaven, the scepter from tyrants.